بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم افتح لنا حكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك وزدنا علما يا كريم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. This is our 11th lesson on our commentary, or of our commentary on Ar-Risalat al-Jami'ah. And we've now covered, the first two sections of the book. So we've covered the section on belief and aqa'id, and now we've just covered all of the aspects of worship as well. And we're now moving into the final section of the book, which is generally speaking about purification of the soul. So there, as we said in an earlier lesson, that there are different terms for this. People call it tazkiyah, or they call it ilm al-akhlaq, character refinement, or sometimes we refer to it as tasawwuf. But all of these terms refer to a single thing, which is how to perfect your character and your soul. So the first thing, the author will cover this in two sections. The first, the way that the author breaks it down is that he talks first about the heart. And that's what this lesson will be. And in the second, our final lesson, he talks about disobedience or acts of disobedience that are related to the limbs. So he talks about sort of an inward aspect and also outward disobedience. So he says, وَحِفْظُ الْقَلْبِ, the author says, وَحِفْظُ الْقَلْبِ مِنَ الْمَعَاصِي وَاجِبٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ وَكَذَا حِفْظُ الْأَعْضَاءِ السَّبْعَةِ فَرْضُ عَيْنٍ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ. So protecting the heart from disobedience is a personal obligation, and the same goes for protecting the 7 body parts from disobedience. It's also a personal obligation. So you'll remember that we've differentiated a number of times between fard ayn and fard kifaya. Fard ayn is a personal obligation that everybody has to do, and fard kifaya is a communal obligation that is lifted if some members or a member of the community takes it upon themselves to do it. So here he says protecting the heart is a fard ayn, and protecting your body parts as well as a fard ayn. They're both personal obligations. So that sounds obvious, but people don't tend not to think of it that way. So they think of their personal obligations as things that they have to do. So like praying, for example, 5 times a day, they think of it as a personal obligation, so that's what they have to do. Or they have to give zakah, so they're very they make sure that they do it. Or they have to go on hajj, so they do it. But when it comes to perfecting their actual character, that's not something immediate or apparent, so people don't think of it as a personal obligation. So someone doesn't think, well, I have X character defect and it's a personal obligation upon me to correct it or fix it. Okay, but that's what it is. It's also a personal obligation. So that's why the author is pointing it out this way. So he says the 7 body parts, the 7 limbs, but they're actually body parts. They're the tongue, the ears, the eyes, the hands, the feet, the stomach, and the private parts. So we'll cover all of them in greater detail in our next lesson. But right now we're focusing on the heart, and it's necessary to focus on the heart because protecting the heart or making the heart whole will correct the rest of the limbs as well. Okay, so if you think of the heart as like a control for all of or a control panel or a control center for all of the limbs, if you correct it, or if you take care of it or ensure that it's pure, that the rest of the limbs will follow suit as well. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ was alluding to when he said that in the body there's a lump of flesh, that if it's good or it's wholesome, that the rest of the body will likewise be so. But if it's corrupted, then likewise the rest of the body. And that's the heart. He says, أَلَا إِنَّ فِي الْجَسَدِ مُضْغَةً إِذَا صَلَحَتْ صَلَحَ الْجَسَدُ كُلُّهُ وَإِذَا فَسَدَتْ فَسَدَ الْجَسَدُ كُلُّهُ أَلَا وَهِيَ الْقَلْبُ. Okay, and this hadith is found in Bukhari and Muslim. Okay, and I mean the inverse is true as well, right? The relationship between the limbs and the heart is like symbiotic. So the heart, if the heart is good, then the rest of the limbs will follow suit as well. But even if the heart is good and the limbs start doing things that are not good, that they'll have an effect on the heart as well. And continuing or insisting on doing these things will affect the heart as well, to the point where the heart itself doesn't care, or the heart itself commands the limbs to continue to do these things. So there's a relationship between both of the two, and that's why we'll look at both in order. But I mean, that being said, the heart is really important, because most people think of it as a kind of command center for the limbs, and they think of the limbs, the actions of the limbs, whether good or bad, as a reflection of what's in the heart. Okay, so if a person does a good action, they see those good actions as a reflection of light in the heart, and if they're engaged in bad actions, they think of that as a reflection of the darkness in the heart. Okay. So the author goes on to talk about specific acts of disobedience that are related to the heart. So he says, فَمِن مَعَاصِ الْقَلْبِ الشَّكُّ فِي اللَّهِ تَعَالَى وَالْأَمْنُ مِن مَكْرِ اللَّهِ وَالْقُنُوتُ مِن رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. So the first thing that the author rahimahullah mentions is doubting God's existence, or doubting one of his attributes. Okay, and needless doubt, or continuously thinking about a specific doubt, or continuously playing something in your mind, just increases that doubt, and it's a cause for serious, it's a cause for being led astray. Any kind of doubt, it's not just with respect to the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but any kind of doubt that you can't easily resolve, but you insist on thinking about it, will just deepen your doubt about something. So if you have doubts about a person, for example, and you continuously think about it, and all you're thinking about is that thing, and then you don't have any way of resolving it, that will just deepen your doubt or your misgivings about a person. And that tells you nothing about whether the misgivings are well grounded or not. It's just continuously thinking about it is one of the deceptions of the shaitan. And the Prophet ﷺ actually says something like akin to this. He says that shaitan will come to a person and will say to him, who created this and who created that? Until it comes to a point where he'll say, okay, who created your Lord? And the Prophet ﷺ said that if it comes to that, just seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and stop. Right? And the Prophet ﷺ doesn't say, says this, like seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and stop, not because the question is even logically valid, and it's not logically valid. Like people who have studied philosophy, or people that have studied logical argumentation, will tell you that kind of argument isn't a valid logical argument for a shaitan to make. But because most people are not able to, most people are not trained in logic, or most people are not able to sort of engage in higher order reasoning, they might find something like that compelling. Right? So rather than just get into like a discussion of philosophy, the Prophet ﷺ just says, seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and stop. Right. The second thing that the author mentions, it's twofold actually. He says, Al-amnu min makri Allahi ta'ala wal-qunutu min rahmatillahi ta'ala. So the first one is feeling that you're secure from the wrath of God, or that you're secure from the punishment of God. And the second aspect is feeling hopeless of divine mercy. So they're almost two sides of this. They're almost two sides of the same coin, and they're both defects of the heart. Where they're both, as the author would say, they're both acts of disobedience of the heart, and they're poor character traits. With respect to the former, the Quran actually says that no one. The only people who feel safe from the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are losers. Right? He says, فَلَا يَأْمَنُ مَكْرَ اللَّهِ إِلَّا الْقَوْمُ الْخَاسِرُونَ. That the only people who feel safe from God's wrath are losers. Right? And conversely, the only ones who despair of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are disbelievers. That إِنَّهُ لَا يَيْأَسُ مِنْ رَوْحِ اللَّهِ إِلَّا الْقَوْمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. That the only people that despair of God's mercy are disbelievers. Okay, and when he describes the um, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing polytheists or mushrikun, he describes them as people who despair of His mercy. He says, أُولَٰئِكَ يَئِسُوا مِن رَحْمَتِي, that they despair of my mercy. So the first one, al-amnu min makrillahi ta'ala, it's feeling safe that it's feeling that you're in a position, or you think that God will never punish you. That's what it is. That you don't think that it's possible that God will actually punish you, and that's actually a serious illness that affects many people. It affects all of us. That people think that that I'm doing X thing, but God isn't going to punish me for it. So it's something that affects numerous people, and you hear people actually say it. That even though the strange thing is that the Quran specifically says that the only people who think that are losers, but people say the exact same thing even today, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala won't punish me for this, or that I'm doing this, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is forgiving, merciful, and that's a type of feeling secure from Allah's wrath, that using His mercy as a reason to continue doing something that is impermissible. Okay, and in the story of the two men and the gardens in Surah Al-Kahf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually describes this kind of attitude or the Quran describes this attitude when the person the wealthy person says, وَلَئِن رُجِدْتُ إِلَىٰ رَبِّي لَأَجِدَنَّ خَيْرًا مِنْهَا مُنْقَلَبًا, that I don't actually think that there's any recompense, but if I were to actually go back to my Lord, I would find something better than this. Right? So that's the kind of attitude that people have today, that well, we'll see what will happen, but I'm pretty sure that nothing's going to happen to me. That's more or less the attitude, and it's an attitude the Quran doesn't describes in disparaging fashion. So it's something that it's a kind of an attitude or an outlook that people have to change. Right? And there's nothing wrong with being hopeful for God's mercy. We're supposed to have hope that God will be merciful, but it can't be taken to the extent that you think that it's not possible that God will punish you. Okay, because that attitude is in direct contravention to the Quran itself, to revealed text. Okay, the real way to deal with to actually act on on hope in God's mercy is to actually do good things. It's not to do bad things, to think that God will punish you. It's to do good things. That's the way that you show that you're that you actually have hope in that God will recompense you. Right? And the Quran actually says this at the end of Surah Al-Kahf. The Quran says, فَمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو لِقَاءَ رَبِّهِ فَلْيَعْمَلْ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا, that whoever looks forward to or actually desires meeting his Lord should do good things. Okay, so that's the kind of raja, or the good kind of raja should lead to you doing good things. And some scholars say that giving sadaqah, or giving in charity, is one of the ways in which a person shows that they have hope in God actually rewarding them, because giving in charity is a true test of faith, because you have this thing and you're just going to give it away. So there's no reason that you have to give it away, but you're giving it away because you have hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will recompense you for this multiple times. Right? So that's a sign that you actually have a good opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not doing bad things and then hoping that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not punish you. The flip side of the coin is this thing that we call qunut, and that's if a person doesn't think that it's possible that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will have mercy on him. Okay, and that's the flip side of it, and it's also blameworthy. It's when a person does things, it can be big or small, but usually it's bigger things, and a person thinks that there's no going back from this, that I've done X, Y, and Z, and it's over, that there's no going back. Like once you've hit a certain point, that there's no forgiving that, and that also is a blameworthy. The author is describing it as a defect of the heart, and it is described in the Quran as something that shouldn't afflict servants. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, addressing servants specifically, he says, قُلْ يَا عِبَادِيَ الَّذِينَ أَسْرَفُوا عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ لَا تَقْنَطُوا مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَغْفِرُ الذُّنُوبَ جَمِيعًا. That إِنَّهُ هُوَ الْغَفُورُ الرَّحِيمُ. That say, my servants who have transgressed against themselves, do not despair of the mercy of Allah. That Allah forgives all sins. He is the most forgiving, the most merciful. Okay, so I mean, this is the same as al-amnu min makrillah, that being fearful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also desirable, right? People have to be fearful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment, but that can't take them to a position where they're so fearful that they believe that there's no going back for them. Okay. And just like we said that being hopeful has a good indication, or has a correct indication, being fearful also has a correct indication, and that's that you don't spend your time doing things that are prohibited. Okay, or that will earn His displeasure, or that will earn His wrath. Okay. The author, rahimahullah, says, وَالتَّكَبُّرُ عَلَى عِبَادِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. وَالتَّكَبُّرُ عَلَى عِبَادِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. So, takabbur is takabbur, generally speaking, is pride, or being proud. But here, takabbur ala ibadillahi ta'ala, it's thinking that you're better than other people. So it's thinking that you're better than other people, and that can be reflected in you either trying to put yourself above them, or trying to bring other people down, or just looking down on other people. And this is, generally speaking, pride, or thinking that you're better than other people, is not a praiseworthy characteristic. The Quran says, إِنَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُسْتَكْبِرِينَ. He doesn't, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُسْتَكْبِرِينَ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not love those who are proud. And the Prophet ﷺ said that a person who has even a speck of pride in his heart will not enter paradise. So pride, being one of the original sins, is not a praiseworthy characteristic. But it's very, we might not call it pride, but the way that the author puts it is takabbur ala ibadillahi ta'ala, that putting yourself above other people, and that's really prevalent in culture today. It's really prevalent. It's really prevalent in internet culture, in like in social media, like just looking and laughing at other people makes up like I don't know if I should say the vast majority of internet culture, but it is like fail culture, like fail movies and that kind of thing, where it's just laughing at other people. Those are not praiseworthy characteristics. It's a type of takabbur, or thinking that you're better than other people, or exposing other people's faults and making a mockery of them, which for the most part there's no public service benefit. If there's a public service benefit, then that's something different. Like if a person is in a position of leadership or something like that, and needs to and people need to know about that, then that's something else. But making videos of people doing things that's just for the purpose of making a mockery of them or laughing at them is not. It's a type of a takabbur ala ibadillahi ta'ala, or thinking that you're better than other people, or thinking that you can't go to that's generally, but speaking with respect to specifically Muslims, it's also something that afflicts a lot of Muslims, that think that they can't go to a mosque, for example, because they don't want to be with other Muslims, right? Or they can't go to this X center or X convention or whatever it is, because they don't want to be they can't be with other Muslims, right? Or they can never go to the mosque again because they're sick and tired of Muslims, for example, right? And those are not praiseworthy characteristics. If something is good in and of itself, you have to do it even if you for some reason disdain other people that are there, right? The Quran even chides the Prophet ﷺ about this. It says, وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ. That make yourself have patience with those that يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُم, that those who call their Lord night and day. And a lot of the commentaries on the Quran say that this is a command to the Prophet ﷺ and also to the believers to have patience and to not think you're better than other people in the community, even though they might be of less social status than you. So a lot of the people that accepted Islam in the beginning were people that were poor, and because they were poor and weren't of high social standing, they might not have had the best of clothes, they might not have even had clothes at all, they might have been dirty, they might have been quote unquote repulsive. So the Quran is saying, وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ, that force yourself to have patience with them. So don't think you're better than other people, especially servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The next thing that the author mentions that is a sign of, or a defect of the heart is ar-riya. Ar-riya, and a flip side to this, he mentions وَالْعُجْبُ بِطَاعَةِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. So he says the first thing, ar-riya, and we talked about riya when we were talking about prayer. We mentioned riya already when we talked about prayer, and it's one of the actions that the Prophet ﷺ describes as destructive. In that it destroys a person's life, but it also destroys a person's actions. So the benefit or the good that you might have accrued from specific actions, they're destroyed by riya. Okay, and the Prophet ﷺ has also called it minor shirk or hidden shirk. He's called it ashirk al-asghar, and he's called it ashirk al-khafi, that hidden shirk or minor shirk. And riya is more or less that you want other people to see you doing things. So you want a specific status in the eyes of people by doing a specific thing. Not any specific thing, but by doing actions of the hereafter. So you want people to see that you're giving a dars, and you're not giving a dars, or you're not giving a lesson because you want to benefit other people, but because you want people to see you doing that. Or you're coming to class not because you want to benefit, but because you want people to say that that person is a student of knowledge. Or so on and so forth, that you're praying because you want people to say, well, look at this person, he prays non-obligatory prayers, and so on and so forth. But and this is destructive, and some of the scholars considered this to be actually making a mockery of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because you're doing things that are for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they're only for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He's the person that can help you and assist you or harm you in any way, but you're taking those things that are for Him and putting them or giving them or doing them for the sake of another person who cannot benefit or cannot harm you in any way. And so they consider that like a riya, a form of a mockery of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. And the Quran, we already mentioned this when we talked about salah, that the Quran also criticizes this, doing actions for other people. When it says فَوَيْنُ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ, that accursed are those who pray, الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ, those who are lackadaisical in their prayer, الَّذِينَ هُمْ يُرَاءُونَ, that those who just do it for other people to see them. Okay? And when it's describing the hypocrites, it says the same thing about them, that they pray just so that other people can see them. That it says that the hypocrites, they never pray illa kusala, that they only pray when they're in a lackadaisical or lazy manner. Yura'un an-nas, that they only do it in this lazy manner, but just so that people can see them, and not for a higher order purpose. Right, so this is riya, the first thing that the author mentions. And I said that the flip side of this, that the author also mentions, is وَالْعُجْبُ بِطَاعَةِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. Al-'ujb bi ta'ati Allah ta'ala, it's being happy with yourself over something that you've done. So you've done something that's good, but now you're full of yourself, you're self-satisfied that you've done something. So you've taught a class, and now you're thinking, well, look at me, I just taught a class to all these people. Or you attended a class and you thought, wow, I'm the deal, because now I'm on my way to becoming a student of knowledge, or and so on and so forth. It's thinking that you're perfect or you're good and being happy about it, and it's forgetting that. And there's nothing wrong with being pleased with doing good. I mean, it's natural to be pleased, and you should be pleased with doing good. right? That should be a person's inside. A person should be happy with doing things that are good, but a person shouldn't forget that the things that they've done aren't a direct result of themselves, but they're from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's grace on that person. So if a person forgets Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's grace and that He could easily take it away from them, that becomes something that we consider ujub, or something that is harmful. Okay, and if it does reach that level, it's one of the main causes of pride and thinking that you're better than other people, and it leads to people thinking that that their acts of disobedience are small, that their own acts of disobedience are small, and it leads to another thing that we mentioned, which is thinking that they won't be punished because they start to think of themselves in this manner. And this, the way I've described ujub is like specifically with being happy over doing like acts of worship, but ujub, or being full of oneself, or being like self-satisfied or smug, is general as well. So again, it's really popular in our culture to be full of yourself, or to not really be full of yourself, but the whole culture of I mean, it's common like to say that you're doing something like a boss, for example, right? Or to walk in a certain manner, and all of it to show that you're happy with yourself, or you're full of yourself, and none of those are praiseworthy characteristics, right? It doesn't mean that you're supposed to walk in like a lowly fashion, or to carry yourself in extreme apparent humility. That also isn't the point of it. But to carry yourself in a proud manner is also not praiseworthy. So the author goes on to talk now about hasad, which is envy. So he says, وَالْحَسَدُ وَالْحِقْدُ عَلَى عِبَادِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى وَمَعْنَى الْحَسَدِ كَرَاهِيَةُ النِّعْمَةِ عَلَى الْمُسْلِمِ وَاسْتِثْقَالُهَا. Right, so hasad and hiqd, there are two ways in which the heart is disobedient. So hasad is being envious, and hiqd is being spiteful or hateful. And the meaning of hasad, which is envy, is actually hating that, as he says, it's hating that someone else has been blessed with a certain thing. So with a certain blessing, and finding it difficult to live with. So that's what he says here, وَمَعْنَى الْحَسَدِ كَرَاهِيَةُ النِّعْمَةِ, so that a person actually hates that someone has been blessed with a certain thing, وَاسْتِثْقَالُهَا, that he finds it difficult to live with. And that actually happens, that you find, you start to, that you hate the fact that a person has been, has got this car, or got this job, or married such and such a person, or has this, or got this job, or is doing this thing with their life, and it starts to eat away at you, and you can't live with yourself, just knowing that this person has this thing, and you want that you want that it be taken away from that person, and that's what hasad is. And one of the reasons that it is so harmful, aside from the fact that it has psychological and even physiological effects on a person, is that it's a kind of an objection to the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has dealt with his bounties and His blessings. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed a person with this job, or with this spouse, or with this position, and who are you to want that this thing should be taken away from that person when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given it, or has blessed him with it in that manner? So that is hasad. And there are a number of ways that you can that indicate that a person has this kind of envy. One is that a person can't live with themselves while another person has that thing. Another way is that the person who is envious is unable to humble themselves in front of that other person. So they can't accept truth from that other person, or they can't accept anything from that person. And that's a sign of them being envious. They're unable to take their advice, or they're unable to benefit from them, or they don't want other people to benefit from that person either. And that happens a lot, even amongst students of knowledge, for example, that they don't want someone to benefit. They're envious of another person, so they don't want they don't want people to benefit from that person. So they stay away from that person because they did X, Y, or Z, or they say X, Y, or Z. And there is no reason why you can't benefit from this person. It's just a form of envy. That they're envious that the person has reached a certain level of knowledge, or that other people listen to them, or that they're popular, or that they have a certain mass appeal. Any of those reasons that they're envious of that, and that's why they act. So the author mentioned here. The author is talking here about hasad, and that's different from simply being jealous or wanting something that a person has as well. So the type of hasad or envy that the author here is talking about is the kind of negative feeling that you want something to be taken away from a person, or you can't stand that a person has something, which is different from wanting the same thing. So if a person is an alim or a scholar, and I internally I feel like I wish I were the same, or I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I be given the same knowledge, that's not the type of blameworthy jealousy or envy that we're talking about. Because you're not hoping that that person will suddenly lose all of their knowledge as well. Or you're not hoping that a person, like, they'll get into a car accident so their car will be totaled and they'll have to buy like a used car or whatever it is. You're just hoping that you have the same thing that the person has, which is different and is not blameworthy. The second thing that the author mentions is al-hiqd. And al-hiqd, we said, is hatred, or it's spite, or it's rancor, and it's different from hasad. It's just hatred for another person. It's being unable to put up with a person's presence, and it's often just it's just unresolved anger for any reason, right? It could be related to hasad or it could be unrelated to hasad. But it in and of itself can lead to hasad. It can lead to envy because you just hate another person. But it has a number of different ways in which it's, or there are a number of different things that we can say the cause of it is hiqd, or the cause of it is spite or hatred. One of them is hasad. Another one of them is just being happy when something bad happens to another person. So, like your brother gets into an accident, for example, and internally you're happy that something bad happened to him, or he loses his job, and inside you're happy that thing happened to him. That's an example of hiqd, or an example of spite, or or cutting people off even when they're trying to get in contact with you. That's an indication that there's something wrong with your heart. Or turning away from people, like cutting them off, but turning away from people as if they're inconsequential, or like pretending you don't see people because you think that they're inconsequential, right? Like if you see someone in the street and it's someone important, you'd want to go say hi to that person. But if it's someone who you think is inconsequential, or you don't have much high regard for, you'll try to pretend that you don't see that person. And that's a sign of a defect in the heart as well. Another sign of hiqd or spite for a person is speaking about them in ways that are impermissible. So when we talk about tongue, we'll talk about some of the things that are impermissible. But for example, lying or saying things about someone, or exposing a person's faults or secrets, things are indications that you have spite for a person, or making a mockery of a person. And it gets worse than that. Physically harming people as well, or preventing them from fulfilling any of some of their rights. All of those are examples of things that are indicative of hiqd. So the author goes on to talk now about some other aspects of disobedience of the heart. He says, وَمِنْهَا, that other aspects of disobedience of the heart are al-israru ala ma'siyatillah. Al-israru ala ma'siyatillah. So persisting in disobedience, that you insist on doing something wrong, that is, you insist on doing things that are wrong, or a specific thing that is wrong. And sometimes, like, that really is all it is. It's just insistence. Like, a person doesn't even like doing it anymore. So maybe they started doing the thing that is wrong, but for a specific reason. But the reason no longer continues. But they just like doing that thing, or right now they just insist on doing that thing, and that's al-israru ala ma'siyatillah. And the Quran, when it describes people that turn back to Him, it describes them as people who don't insist on doing on continuing on a course of action. He says, وَلَمْ يُصِرُّوا عَلَى مَا فَعَلُوا وَهُمْ يَعْلَمُونَ. That they don't insist on continuing what they used to do. Okay? Imam al-Ghazali, he mentions a few ways to break the cycle of persisting on disobedience. One of the ways he mentions is to remember verses in the Quran, general verses in the Quran that are meant to scare people that are doing evil or people that are engaged in disobedience. So there are a number of verses that are meant to scare people, and he says just reading them or mentioning them or recollecting them will put you in your place, so to speak. Another way to break the cycle of persisting on disobedience is to remember or to read stories about pious predecessors who had something bad befall them because of a sin they did. Okay, so if you read books about pious predecessors, you'll see that a lot of times they'll say that this person did certain thing, did like a certain action, and saw the result of it immediately in their life. And one of the reasons that they could very easily tie something bad happening to something bad they did is that they didn't do many bad things. So it's not like our life where like every day we're doing something bad. And so like if bad things happen to us, we don't know which bad thing we did. This is a reward for it. But a lot of the pious predecessors, when they did something wrong, or they said something about someone, or they ate too much, or they did like even a small thing, they know that what they did was wrong, and they clearly see something bad happening to them after. So Imam al-Ghazali is here saying that one of the ways to break that cycle is to look at the clear cause and effect that it has in people's lives. That they do something and they see clearly that something bad happens to them afterwards. The third way that he mentions is to is kind of a spin-off of that, and that is to recognize that that being punished in this life for a person's sin is a reality. Like things that happen in this life or bad things that happen in this life are often because of a person's transgressions in this life. So Imam al-Ghazali says that a person who's insisting on doing evil might not actually care about the hereafter, because they see it as something far away. But if you tell them that it has an actual impact on their life itself, they might stop doing acts of disobedience. And the last way that he mentions is, the first way that he had mentioned is to mention general verses that are meant to scare people away from disobedience. And the last way that he mentions is to mention or to recall specific verses that are related to the specific action. So if a person is engaged in a specific crime, to have that person read, or for that person themselves to go and read specific verses or specific hadith that relate to that crime or that act of disobedience. The next thing that the author mentions, he says, وَالْبُخْلُ بِمَا أَوْجَبَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى. And so a type of the heart, or a way that the heart is disobedient, is by being stingy with respect to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has rendered mandatory. And so there are obligatory financial obligations like zakah, and in some cases charity. Like if a person is in dire need and you're able to fulfill that need, and that person is unable to have their need fulfilled through another means, then it would become obligatory. So that also falls within this rubric. So greed, that the author mentions al-bukhl, greed and stinginess are both despicable, and everybody knows that. It isn't praiseworthy to be like a Scrooge McDuck or something. Everybody knows that is despicable, right? So the Quran says that whoever saves himself from the greed of their soul is truly successful. It says وَمَنْ يُوقَ شُحَّ نَفْسِهِ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. And it says that whoever is stingy, that they're only being stingy from with respect to themselves. It says وَمَنْ يَبْخَلْ فَإِنَّمَا يَبْخَلُ عَنْ نَفْسِهِ وَاللَّهُ الْغَنِيُّ وَأَنْتُمُ الْفُقَرَاءُ. That Allah is actually rich and you are the ones that are poor. So in these two verses we talked about two things. One is shuh and one is bukhl. Shuh is actually like an extension of bukhl. Bukhl is like being greedy and trying to hold on to the things that you have. So like you have this thing and you don't want to give it up because you're stingy, even though you don't have any specific need for this thing. That's bukhl. But shuh is like an extension of it. It's like you don't own this thing, someone else does, but you want it. But you want it just because just because. And that's a type of, that's an sort of an hyperbolic greed. The next thing that the author mentions is وَسُوءُ الظَّنِّ بِاللَّهِ وَبِخَلْقِ اللَّهِ والتصغير لما عظم الله من طاعة أو معصية أو قرآن أو علم أو جنة أو نار. So he says that one of the defects of the heart is having a low opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and of His creation. And that is a defect of the heart, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَنَا عِنْدَ ظَنِّ عَبْدِي بِي, that I am as my servant thinks of me. And this doesn't mean, like we said, it doesn't mean that you should, having a poor opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't mean that you should only focus on Allah's mercy. That's not what we're talking about here, that a person should be balanced between having a concern for punishment and also having hope for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy. And specifically, someone who's disobedient should focus on punishment and fear, because they're insisting on a course of conduct that is disobedient. But it is generally thinking poor or having a poor opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His choices and His decree and what He's done, and also thinking that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not forgive. It's a form of like objecting to the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has done things. And I mean, in movies and TV shows and things like that, like the most comical way that is expressed is like a person falling to their knees and screaming at the sky when something bad happens. So like someone dies, someone falls to their knees and like screams at the sky, kind of thing, right? And that's like a kind of like an objection to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed, and it's not a permissible course of action. He says, the author says, billahi wa bi khalqillah, that having a poor thinking poorly of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation is also blameworthy. And we kind of touched on this already. Having a low opinion of people is blameworthy. You shouldn't think that people are bad or harbor suspicion about people that is more or less baseless. Right? The Quran says in Surah Al-Hujurat, يا أيها الذين آمنوا اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم. That يا أيها الذين آمنوا, that those all you who believe, leave aside or put aside most suspicion. Put aside most suspicion, because some suspicion is blameworthy. And so, and this happens a lot, like as well. It's not just internet culture. So this isn't like, I'm not railing against modern technology or anything, but you see it a lot on social media, for example, when people they think bad of other people and the things that they've said or positions that they take for no reason. So the most the thing that people spring towards most quickly is like objecting to something that someone said or something did. So if you post something on social media, for example, someone will object to it, even if on the face of it it's good. Or if something happy happens and you post on it, somebody will post something negative about it. Like, how could you post this? Well, it has this connotation, that connotation. So all of these are thinking poorly of other people when their speech or their actions, like prima facie, like on the face of it, it seems good, but you're finding something behind it that you think is like nefarious. So there's something nefarious behind your speech or your actions that we need to point out. When in reality, there's nothing like that you could have interpreted their speech or their actions in a more generous manner. And this isn't being naive. It's not like you need to be naive or something. You just need to train yourself to see the good in other people and to think that what they're doing is good as opposed to what they're doing is evil. I mean, if it can go both ways, right? If it's clearly evil, then yeah, you would point it out. But this kind of thing, it's an attitude or it's an outlook that you can train yourself to. You can train yourself to do that. When you think of when you see someone doing something, try to make an excuse for them, or try to think of a reason in which, or a way in which the thing that they did could have been right. And that will like train you to have like a better opinion of people. I remember that once when I was studying in Saudi Arabia, I used to travel a lot in different, to different cities. So I would like road trip every weekend. And because of that, I would have like coffee cups and like a croissant, like paper bags from croissants and that kind of thing in my car. And so every couple of days I would throw them out. But I had just come back from road trip and I went to meet one of my Shaykh for a class, and I didn't have time to clean out my car. So I went to the class, and after the class, he lived close to the masjid, so he used to walk to the masjid, but he asked me to give him a ride back to his house after class. So I was really embarrassed because I knew that he would see all the stuff in my car when he comes with like coffee cups and that kind of thing. But when he came in the car, before I could even say apologize that I'm sorry that I have all this stuff in my car, he said it's good that you gathered all this stuff in your car and you don't litter in the street. Like that's what he said to me. And even though my car is dirty, like his first reaction was one of like husnul dhan, like having a good opinion of me, right? So like he saw the positive in it, whereas like other people, even myself, would be focusing on the negative. So there are some people who when they say this kind of thing, that they're just putting on airs. But he wasn't putting on airs. Like it really was that the case that he sees the good in people, or he sees the good in situations. So this kind of thing, it's an attitude that you can train in yourself. The author says, وَالتَّصْغِيرُ لِمَا عَظَّمَ اللَّهُ مِنْ طَاعَةٍ أَوْ مَعْصِيَةٍ أَوْ قُرْآنٍ أَوْ عِلْمٍ أَوْ جَنَّةٍ أَوْ نَارٍ. So thinking, so looking down on, or thinking, or having a low opinion, or thinking less of anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has thought highly of. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned a lot of things in the Quran, or He's given weight to a lot of things. So whatever He has taken seriously, we should also take seriously. So we shouldn't have this attitude like who needs Jannah kind of thing, like I don't need Jannah kind of thing. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned a lot of rewards in Jannah, for example. So to have this attitude like I don't need this reward, or I'm not interested in this reward, or that doesn't interest me, that's not a praiseworthy thing to say, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made this thing important, so it should also be something that you consider important too. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ, that, or ذَلِكَ وَمِنْ شَعَائِرِ اللَّهِ ذَلِكَ وَمَنْ يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرِ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ, that whoever glorifies the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is part of taqwa, that whoever takes seriously these rights, that's part of taqwa. And he says, وَمَنْ يُعَظِّمْ حُرُمَاتِ اللَّهِ فَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَهُ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِ, that whoever glorifies or makes important or holds in important things that are sacred or sanctified with God, that's better for him with his Lord. Okay, so this affects things that the author mentions, like Quran, the Jannah, or paradise, hell, things like that. But it also includes things like acts of disobedience. So acts of disobedience that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has clearly warned against, for example, things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has clearly placed high importance on, they're not things that we should take lightly. So we shouldn't say, oh, I just did this, it's not a big deal kind of thing. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has clearly, maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has cursed this action. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, has cursed taking riba, or has cursed taking interest. So a person can't say, well, I just did this and it's not a big deal, because it is a big deal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed importance on it, so it should be something that we place importance onto, and so on and so forth. The author says, بل وكل ذلك من المعاصي والخبائث المهلكات. All of those are part of are acts of disobedience. All of the things that we mentioned, and they're destructive as well. بل بعد ذلك من المهلكات, things that destroy a person's life, but also destroy a person's good deeds. بل بعد ذلك مما يدخل في الكفر, that some of those things can actually take a person into outright disbelief. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ تَعَالَى مِنْ ذَلِكَ, and we seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from that. So the author was talking about acts of disobedience, and now the author will go, or acts of disobedience that are related to the heart. Now he'll talk about the flip side of it, which is acts of obedience with respect to the heart. So he starts listing some of them. He says, وَمِن طَاعَةِ الْقَلْبِ الْإِيمَانُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَقِينُ وَالْإِخْلَاصُ وَالْيَقِينُ وَالْإِخْلَاصُ. So some of the acts of disobedience with respect to the heart are faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we already did this in our, we already covered this in our first lesson. We said that it was faith is belief in the heart with respect to everything that the Prophet ﷺ has brought from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says, وَالْيَقِينُ, this is like the opposite of when he mentioned shak or doubt. So yaqeen is indicating the strength of the faith and it being firmly grounded, and that it's not being shaken, or it's not, a person doesn't entertain random thoughts. Okay, and a person can get this kind of yaqeen or get this certainty or strength in their faith by reciting the Quran, by reflecting on the attributes and the perfection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, on reflecting on the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reading or reflecting on the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he says, وَالْإِخْلَاصُ, and we did ikhlas. We said ikhlas is sincerity. It's trying to, ikhlas is trying to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not having any ulterior motive. That's what pure ikhlas is, not having any other ulterior motive, whether it's big or small. So, and if there's another motive, then the pure ikhlas is gone, even if a person is still trying to get to God. Even if a person is still trying to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imam al-Qushayri, I think we mentioned this in an earlier lesson, he says al-ikhlas is cleaning your action or cleansing your action from the notice of creation. So it's making sure that your action is something that you don't care if other people notice it. And that's what ikhlas is. So it's not putting on a show for them, or trying to have them praise you, or something like that. And then he says what tawadu'. Tawadu' is humility. It's the opposite of pride. So a lot of the things that he'll mention now are just the opposite of things that we've talked about already when we talked about disobedience. So humility is the opposite of pride. And the Prophet ﷺ said that anybody who is humble before God, that God will raise him in rank. He says, "Ma tawadda'a ahadun lillahi illa rafa'ahu Allah." That no one, literally, that no one made himself humble before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, except that God raised him in rank. And there are a number of indicators of humility. One of them is that if someone speaks truth, that you're able to accept it irrespective of who it is. So it doesn't have to be your favorite shaykh or a person from your specific community or your friend, but anybody who says something that's true, you're able to accept it, and that's a sign of humility. Another sign of humility that is sometimes mentioned is that you're able to take benefit. Well, the first was about taking general benefit, but it's also from material benefit, so that you're able to hang out with people of different rank, for example, or different class, or that you're able to eat with people of different status. So some people only want to eat with people that are of a certain class or a certain status, or are like them. But if someone else invites them, they won't want to go, and that's a sign of a lack of humility. But the author says, وَالنَّصِيحَةُ لِلْمُسْلِمِينَ وَالنَّصِيحَةُ لِلْمُسْلِمِينَ. So this is being, an-nasiha is usually translated as good advice, an-nasiha, but generally speaking, an-nasiha means just being concerned about the welfare of other people. Being concerned about the welfare of other people, and that's what the Prophet ﷺ means when he says ad-dinu nasiha, that this religion is having that sincere concern. Okay, it's an integral part of it. So it's trying to get good for other people. That's what nasiha is. So it can be it could be by guiding them to what's good. It could be by telling them what's good, which is usually what we think of when we think of nasiha. But it could also be by protecting them, by covering their faults, by teaching them. All of those things fall within the rubric of nasiha, because nasiha is trying to get good for other people. Okay, so It's not simply like commanding them to do what's good or forbidding them from doing what's wrong. Okay. And then the author says, وَالسَّخَاء. Sakha is being generous. But it's not just being generous, it's that when a person is generous, that they're happy. So that they're giving, but they're happy. So they're not angry when they give. And a lot of times when people give, they're angry that they have to give. So if someone asks them for money, they don't want to give inside, but they don't want to look bad or something. So they give, but internally they're angry. Like, why am I giving this person? Or why is this person asking me? Or doesn't this person have a job? Or can't they find a job? Or all of these things that go through a person's mind. But that's different from a person asking you and you're happy to give, or you're happy to assist that person that is asking you. Right? And this next thing that the author mentions is وَحُسْنُ الظَّنِّ وَتَعْظِيمُ شَعَائِرِ اللَّهِ. And both of these are flip sides of things that we've just talked about. One of them, the first is having a good opinion of other people. And the second is to consider important the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has considered important. The author then says, وَالشُّكْرُ عَلَى نِعْمِ اللَّهِ كَالْإِسْلَامِ وَالطَّاعَةِ وَسَائِرِ النِّعْمِ. And then he says, وَالصَّبْرُ عَلَى الْبَلَاءِ مثل الأمراض والمحن وموت الأحبة وفقد المال وتسلط الناس والصبر على الطاعة والصبر على المعاصي. So the first thing that the author mentions here is being thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all of His blessings. And he mentions two of the important ones, or two of the really big ones, which are Islam and obedience. The actual bounties of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are countless. The Quran itself says that وَإِن تَعُدُّوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ لَا تُحْصُوهَا. That if you try to count or if you were to enumerate the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you wouldn't be able to count them. The thanks that you give, it can be with your thanks can be with anything. It can be with your heart, it can be with your tongue, it can be with your actions, it can be with a combination of something. But shukr is just doing anything that indicates that you're glorifying the giver because of the fact that they gave you something. That's what shukr is. And legally, shukr is using the thing that you've been given for their purpose. That you're using the thing that you've been given for their purpose and not for an act of disobedience. So like you've been given eyes, for example, to look at and to help you to look and to be able to help you find your way and to help you with your life and that kind of thing. And it wasn't given to you to look at things that are impermissible to look at. So shukr is using your eyes, for example, for things that are permissible or things that are praiseworthy, and not using it in ways that are disobedient. So he mentions Islam and ta'ah. He mentions Islam because it's a huge blessing. Islam and ta'ah, obedience, they're both the biggest blessings that we can think of, and that's actually why some people say that in Surah Al-Rahman, at the beginning of Surah Al-Rahman, the Quran says, Ar-Rahmanu 'allama al-Quran khalaqa al-insan. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts the fact that He taught people the Quran before the fact that He actually created them. So He puts the ni'mah or the blessing of their hidayah or their guidance before the ni'mah of actually bringing them into existence. So some people say the reason for that is because hidayah is a bigger blessing than creation, because creation affects everybody. Everybody's there, everybody's available, but only some people have been given guidance. He says, وَالصَّبْرُ عَلَى الْبَلَاءِ مِثْلُ الْأَمْرَاضِ. So having patience when these things happen, and he mentions these things because there are situations in which people are short of patience. So sickness, for example, when people get sick, sometimes they think, well, why me? Why did this happen to me? I'm a good person. I didn't do anything, so why do I have this illness? And so on and so forth. With like tribulations that they face in their life, the same thing, or people around them pass away, or they lose their wealth. Or people are put above them, so they're in a position, they're subject to other people's whims. All of these things require patience, and because patience is such an important trait, it's mentioned numerous times in the Quran, and it's given the reward for it is not restricted like the reward for other things. So the Quran, for example, says, إِنَّمَا يُوَفَّى الصَّابِرُونَ أَجْرَهُم بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ. That people, that those who are patient will be recompensed without measure. Without measure. So everything has a measure. Everything is given a measure. When every good action is given a measure, except patience. Okay, and that's why, because it's so important in a person's life. So the author says, وَالصَّبْرُ عَلَى الطَّاعَةِ وَالصَّبْرُ عَنِ الْمَعَاصِي. So the things that the author mentioned, they're things that you would normally associate patience with. So when someone dies, for example, everyone knows that you need to be patient. When you lose your job, you need to be patient. So people associate patience with those things, right? And the Quran actually mentions it. It says, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. So the Quran mentions the things that a person would normally need patience for, right? So like in times of fear, in times of hunger, a person loses their wealth, a person loses their crops. Those are times when a person would need patience. So the Quran says, وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ, give glad tidings to the patient. But some things that a person might not we might not associate patience with is ta'ah and ma'asiyah, so obedience and disobedience. So a person needs to have patience with their ta'ah as well, with their obedience. So they should have the patience when they're with their obedience, that they don't fall into disobedience. So being obedient is not easy. Like doing the 5 daily prayers, for example, fasting in Ramadan, going for Hajj, doing these things, abstaining from a number of different things. They all require patience. So even if you're obedient, you have to consider the fact that you need to continue being patient so that you can continue on that course of action, even though it's difficult. And likewise, it's the same for it's the same for disobedience. That if you're on a course of disobedience, that you have to be patient with yourself and hold yourself back from continuing on that course of action. Right, especially when you're accustomed to doing something. So if you've accustomed yourself to doing something that is disobedient over a long period of time, you have to have patience with yourself in holding yourself back from that. The author then says, وَالثِّقَةُ بِالرِّزْقِ مِنَ اللَّهِ وَبُغْضُ الدُّنْيَا وَعَدَاوَةُ النَّفْسِ وَالشَّيْطَانِ. Yeah. So الثِّقَةُ بِالرِّزْقِ مِنَ اللَّهِ, that's having dependence on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for your provision and not anyone else. So recognizing that your provision or your sustenance, all of it comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and being dependent upon Him. Like remembering that this comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and isn't something that comes from you, or it's not something that comes because of another person or because of another organization or a company or so on and so forth. And the Quran actually says this, وَمَا مِن دَابَّةٍ فِي الْأَرْضِ إِلَّا عَلَى اللَّهِ رِزْقُهَا. That there is no creation on the earth except that Allah provides for it. So a person will only get what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed for them, and won't get any more, won't get any less. So it's not something that a person should consistently or continuously worry about. So they say that one of the greatest causes for divorce, or the greatest cause of divorce, is financial matters, and that's because people are always worrying about finances and what's going to happen tomorrow. But people should have thiqah, or they should have reliance or dependence on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for their sustenance. He says, وَبُغْضُ الدُّنْيَا, having dislike or having hatred for this world. And that doesn't mean that you should go live in a cave by yourself somewhere or something like that, or disavow this life completely. It just means that you should see this life for what it is. That it's transient, you're only here for a short period of time, and that you shouldn't be deluded by it or consider it significant or give it more than it's worth. I mean, the dunya, or this life, it's never described in the Quran in a praiseworthy manner. Every time the Quran describes the dunya, it's talking about it in a blameworthy manner. And that alone should be an indication, or that alone suffices as an indication that it's not something that should be given more than its due. Okay? They say that everything bad in this world comes from a love of this world. So every ill, whether it's like an internal ill, like hatred or pride, or even bigger things like war, they all come from a love of this world, or giving this world more than its due. Right? The author says, وَعَدَاوَةُ النَّفْسِ وَالشَّيْطَانِ, that one of the ways or one of the acts of obedience of the heart is to struggle with yourself. Is to struggle with yourself and to struggle with shaitan. وَعَدَاوَةُ النَّفْسِ وَالشَّيْطَانِ. So one should struggle with themselves because their self is always commanding them towards evil, and as well as shaitan, and not falling for his tricks or for his deception. And the author here puts first a nafs before shaitan, because a nafs is a bigger threat to a person, because the nafs or the soul comes to a person in like the guise of a friend, whereas the shaitan is a clear enemy. Right? The Quran says, "Inna shaytana lakum aduwwun mubin." It's a clear enemy, but the nafs or the soul isn't a clear enemy. Like, he'll come to you and try to tell you to do things, and will try to trick you into doing things by pointing out the benefits of it, or by trying to pretend that it's not a big deal. But and it comes as a friend and not an enemy, so it's easier to incline towards it. Yeah. The author says, وَمَحَبَّةُ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ وَمَحَبَّةُ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ وَصَحَابَتِهِ وَأَهْلِ بَيْتِهِ وَالتَّابِعِينَ وَالصَّالِحِينَ وَالرِّضَى عَنِ اللَّهِ وَالتَّوَكُّلِ عَلَيْهِ وَغَيْرُ ذَلِكَ مِنَ الْوَاجِبَاتِ الْقَلْبِيَّةِ الْمُنْجِيَةِ. This is the end of the section. The author says that that loving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger and His companions and His family and the succeeding generation and pious people is an act of obedience of the heart. And all this is like loving God, of course, is a high station, and an indicator for it is that is that a person prefers God towards other things, and that they're ready to follow His commands, even if and to do things that are pleasing for Him, even if his self doesn't want to do that. That's an indication that you love someone else, right? An indication that you love someone else is that you put them above yourself, and it's the same with God. So when you have love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you put Him and His concerns, His commands and His prohibitions above your own or what you might think your own needs are. Right? He says, وَرَسُولِهِ, that loving the Messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and following him is a sign that you love is that you love the Messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not just claiming that you love the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but it's following him. That's the sign. The Quran says this, قُلْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُحِبُّونَ اللَّهَ فَاتَّبِعُونِي يُحْبِبْكُمُ اللَّهُ وَيَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ ذُنُوبَكُمْ. That if you love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then follow me, Allah will love you and forgive your sins. And we already gave the definition of the companions at the beginning of this lesson. They were those who were present with the Prophet ﷺ even for a short period after him becoming a prophet and dying as a Muslim. And his family, he says, وَأَهْلِ بَيْتِهِ, that's the believers from Banu Hashim and Muttalib. Right? The Prophet ﷺ said in Sahih Hadith that I'm leaving you two things, the book and my family. The book of Allah and my family. He says, what tabi'in, and the tabi'in are the generation after the Prophet, after the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and was-salihin, loving the pious people, even though if you're not one of them, is an act of obedience. Right? The Prophet ﷺ said, al-mar'u ma'a man ahab, that a person is with those who he loves, with those who he loves, even if he's not amongst them. Right? And Imam Shafi'i said, "Uhibbu salihina wa lastu minhum." I love the people of righteousness, even though I'm not one of them. Right? Finally, he says, وَالرِّضَى عَنِ اللَّهِ, that being pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed. So we already mentioned this, the screaming at the sky thing, that no matter what happens, that you're pleased with the decree and the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that you're not angry with him, because of something that he has decreed, and that you don't think that you know better how the world ought to be run. Right? He says, وَالتَّوَكُّلُ عَلَيْهِ, that relying on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we mentioned this when we talked about rizq or provisions of a person. But generally speaking, a person should try to inculcate that reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not on himself or on other people. The Quran says, وَعَلَى اللَّهِ فَلْيَتَوَكَّلِ الْمُتَوَكِّلُونَ, that people, believers, should rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says, وَمَنْ يَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ فَهُوَ حَسْبُهُ, that whoever relies upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that alone is sufficient for him. Right? And he says, وَغَيْرُ ذَلِكَ مِنَ الْوَاجِبَاتِ الْقَلْبِيَّةِ الْمُنْجِيَةِ, that and the other things that obviously the author, just like with acts of disobedience, the author can't list all of the acts of obedience, but he's here pointing to the fact that there are other things, that acts of obedience that the heart can engage in, that would save a person in the hereafter, and they're mentioned in books of tasawwuf or tazkiyat al-nafs, or purification of the soul. So we'll stop on that note. That's the first half of the section of this book on tasawwuf or tazkiyat al-nafs, and with respect to the heart. And in the second half, we'll talk about the 7 limbs that the author mentioned earlier. وصلى اللهم وسلم وزد وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.